Thank you, everyone, and greetings. I'm just right. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so let me just respond firstly to all of you. And in this time of a pandemic, I just want to greet you wherever you are and hope that you're well, and that your families are well, that if you're grieving for someone who's lost, my sympathies to you. And all I would say is grieve as long as you wish to grieve and rejoin life when you're ready. So my heart goes out to you all. I speak to you here from New Zealand, from a small town called Whakatane at the moment. It's the weekend, it's Sunday, and I'm visiting my father, who's 94 and who's also a very distinguished Māori studies scholar, sitting in my home territory of Ngāti Awa at the moment. So I can't see all of you and all your faces, but I just want to say tēnā koutou katoa, greetings to you all. Right. So I think I'd really like you to be thinking about questions as I talk in the first part, introducing some ideas so that it's an interactive session. I don't really like to talk for too long on Zoom. One, it's exhausting for me. B, I think it's exhausting for you. So I'll talk a little bit about the decolonizing methodologies and I think where we're at now. And then I think Sinfree will have some questions and interaction. Is that right?
Yes.
And then,
yes.
Yeah, and then some questions from you. So firstly, the third edition of Decolonizing Methodologies is about to be published this month, I think, or next month. It's published by Z Books, who have now been bought out by Bloomsbury. Books. So it's coming out with essentially a new publisher, and I'm looking forward to that. And I want to talk to maybe some of the changes in the book as a way of saying, you know, where have we come to in the decolonizing methodologies? My first point that I would say is we still need to decolonize methodologies, decolonize theory, decolonize institutions, decolonize society. Because if anything, the pandemic has shown us the deep inequities, the deep racism that exists, particularly in what are called settler colonial societies, but even those societies that, you know, have been colonized by other, like non-Western countries, experience the same institutional inequities that we have. That, you know, as I speak, there are groups, Indigenous communities, minority communities all around the world who are excluded, who are suffering, and who take the brunt of, you know, a dominant population's hatred and anger and resentment and jealousy. And so I think the work of decolonizing methodologies is really important. And I know some of you will come from communities like the ones I come from, where they say things like, you know, we're the most researched population in the world. So I've been all over the world and I've heard that expression, we're the most researched population in the world. And to me, the issue is not whether that is empirically true or not. The issue is what compels people to say that. What is it that has made them feel like they are the most researched? And I think it's this kind of overwhelming sense that researchers have just come and taken and left. So there are a lot of terms now for that, like helicopter research, fly in, interview, fly out. And so as a master's student, I was intrigued by methodologies because as a master's student, that's really where I started to confront what it meant to do research. But that was many, many, many years ago now. And having, experience beyond just doing a single piece of research, my concern now is the whole institution of research, the institutions of knowledge that prop up certain kinds of research. And you would all have heard that, and recently around the pandemic, in terms of the response to science. And I think one of the interesting debates in Indigenous methodologies is whether Indigenous knowledge is a science or not a science. I don't think any Indigenous knowledge should be made to fit into a box determined by the West of what is science or what is not science. But I know scholars like Gregory Kahete would argue that there are many aspects of Indigenous knowledge that are absolutely, based on empirical knowledge, deep observations of the environment, but that there are also many aspects of Indigenous knowledge which are based on our worldviews, our relationships with the earth and the environment, our ability and belief in dreaming, in spiritual awakening, in spiritual well-being, that those things are also part of our knowledge system and are often stripped away, if not ridiculed, by Western science. But I think the pandemic has shown, especially now in the delivery of vaccines, the science, the biomedical research scientists have no clues whatsoever about how to deliver a vaccine to our communities. You need different kinds of scientists to do that. And they might be people in the logistics area, truck drivers, community activists, people who know our communities, elders. Those are our scientists that we need right now. So I think the pandemic kind of, in a way, illustrates the importance of building our capacity as Indigenous and, people of colour who do research, people really who, have this dual responsibility to be critiquing and contesting Western sort of ideologies, but also having the credibility to work with other knowledges, to work with peoples who have been excluded from research. And, that's a big burden. If you are all doing that research, I just acknowledge the kind of dual, if not multiple, burdens that you carry. But in a way, you have no choice. I think if you're Indigenous or a researcher of colour, there's no choice in a sense about the work that we do. And rather than bemoan the fact and try and be like a white researcher, I think we embrace our difference and we make out of that difference a life and a career worth living and worth doing. So in the new edition, I've added a new chapter with some new projects. And what I've done over the last few years at conferences is really ask younger scholars, emerging researchers, postgraduate students, whether that chapter, the 25 projects, was still relevant to them. One of the challenges of doing a new edition of a book is whether there's a point to it, whether why can't they just reprint it? What is it? What else can I say? Or is it even still relevant? Because there's so many new fabulous books by our scholars, that maybe, the message of decolonizing methodologies is now being diffused and dispersed, and it's no longer required. But they kind of assured me it's still relevant, that the original 25 projects are still important to them. But in the workshops that I used to do, we've identified 20 more projects. And I use the word project in a really down-to-earth way. I'm not good at inventing flash new terms. To me, a lot of what we're doing is work. And I remember an Indigenous elder just said, he was asking, what does an academic person do? What do you do? And most of our people don't know what we do. They think we drink coffee all the time. And I tried to explain to him, and he said, "Darlene, you work. You do work, and that's what's important." So that's my approach to everything. It's we do our work, and our work is in the theory and research space, the teaching space. Nothing fancy about that in terms of a hierarchy of work, in my view. And the kind of work we do is with our minds, our intellectual training. But, we can think we're really clever, but many academics that I know are emotionally undereducated, underdeveloped. And so we're not the greatest of human beings in terms of how we've been schooled and educated. And we need to be humble about what we know and understand that we've been trained to do certain kinds of work that contributes to the well-being of our peoples. And I just think it's as simple as that. That's our role as teachers, scholars, and researchers. So the 20 new projects, I'm not going to tell you what they are today. I'll leave that for you to discover. In some ways, though, as a hint, I've enhanced some of the original 25 because some of those original ideas have been advanced, if you like, and broken out into a number of other categories, which shows the kind of growth, I think, of work. The way I've identified the projects is not just by looking at the literature. In fact, when I started writing Decolonizing Methodologies, there was really no literature. So what I did was, because I was already traveling around different parts of the world, was to look at where people put their energy. When I went to Indigenous gatherings, what were our peoples doing? Where were they putting their hearts and minds and their work? And it's really out of that sort of approach that I came up with the original 25 projects. And I've used the same approach with the next 20. And all I can say is our peoples are doing more work. They're not subtracting any work, but there is more capacity to do some work than there is to do other work. And I just think that's a reflection in a way of education, of development, of where certain communities are at present. I'm always reminded, and this morning I looked at the news on Brazil, and they're on the sort of cusp of the collapse of a health system. And so when some of my colleagues look at Brazil, they look at the country Brazil. I don't look at the country Brazil. I look at the Indigenous context of Brazil, the Indigenous peoples in Brazil, who right from the start of this pandemic have taken massive hits. I think it is almost like a genocide. the failure of governance to look after them. And I just know, from what we've experienced, I just know in my heart that for many Indigenous communities in the Amazon, there's no way they'll be getting the help they need, the compassion they deserve. And there are other places around the world where Indigenous communities are still fighting for their physical survival, right? They don't really have a choice about, is it Indigenous knowledge they're trying to protect or their lives? And I think the scale of the Indigenous struggle is still this, from sheer physical survival as a people to, trying to be self-determining, arguing in the United Nations for our rights as Indigenous peoples. The scale and the scope between those two struggles are really what we're about, I think, what we always have to remember. And especially for me, working from the context of Aotearoa New Zealand, New Zealand is a well-off country. And that means, our context here for Māori people is very different to the context of others. So those nuances in the Indigenous people struggle, they're important. They're not just what happens in the political sphere, because they happen in our work. They influence the way we have to nuance our work and understand what it, when we use a term, Indigenous or methodology or theory or decolonizing, the fullness of that term, so that it's not a narrow idea about one possibility or one sort of pathway for one type of configuration of being Indigenous or being colonized. I think it's, and as a teacher, I really believe this. I believe in keeping terms open, keeping ideas open. Don't close the door. And I think in our world, the Indigenous world, it's really important. You don't close the door, because in closing a door, you close the hope for a people who haven't yet made it to the door. Leave an extra chair at the table, because there's a people who are making their way to sit at the table. And I think if we think about that intellectually, it's the same idea, that we keep ideas open. There's some things we can be definitive about now because of the moment we're in, but it's kind of knowing that context change, and there's always these other possibilities that we have to bear in mind. So that might not be comfortable for students who like things to be clear and definitive and certain. I'm someone who kind of is comfortable with uncertainty and comfortable with new possibilities that I haven't kind of imagined yet. And I just think that's the world that we're in. And the sooner you get used to it, the easier your life will be. But also, if you come out of our communities, you live with uncertainty. Intuitively, you know how to live with uncertainty. And one of the problems of, academia and scholarship is they keep trying to define certainty. They keep trying to, this is what it is, this is the theory of X, this is the theory of everything. And, intuitively, whenever that claim is made, I'm thinking, no, that's not how it works. We're still on this big journey, and it's important to keep these windows open, doors open, possibilities open, for where we will be. So just to kind of round off then, this new edition also has a new introduction. I asked some young scholars from different parts of the Indigenous world to write me 800 words to put into the introduction. And like predictably, most Indigenous scholars, they wrote 1,000 words, not 800 words, 1,200 words. And so they're about 1,000 words. And so I asked them to, I guess, introduce the book, but also talk about its relevance to their careers. And I did that deliberately because they're the next generation of teachers. They're the next generation of researchers. And I'm retiring, formally out of institutions. I'll still be working, but, my professional career inside the university is coming to a close. And I wanted younger scholars who are going to carry this work forward to introduce the book. And then that new chapter on the 20 projects. So just to sum up, what does that mean? I think in the context of the Rhodes Must Fall movement that came out of South Africa, the Black Lives Matter, the Idle No More, the missing and murdered Indigenous Aboriginal women. There are struggles all around the world as we speak that to me speak to the ongoing significance of our struggles to decolonize academic knowledge, decolonize academic institutions, because our universities in particular have been set up as arbiters of what counts as legitimate knowledge and have this, global, these systems are global, and the ideas about race just circulate through academic institutions. And so our struggle to decolonize is also a global struggle. It's not just what some of us here do, or colleagues in South Africa do, or colleagues in Malaysia do. It's what all of us have to do, because the system that we're trying to question and critique and transform is a global system that circulates ideas through a whole range of both obvious and then also mysterious academic processes. For example, publishing. We can decolonize methodologies all we want, but if a journal won't publish your work, then that's, the whole publishing arena needs decolonizing. The fact that journals are often old boys clubs, the editorial board is dominated by certain kinds of views. So I know in our context, we've also had to start our own journals. We've had to seek publishers who will publish our work. So the struggle isn't just about doing a single research project or your thesis, your PhD, or your first article or your first book. It is a struggle against a system, a very racist system. And in that struggle, we're all in it together, and we all have to be targeting different parts of that system. It's a little bit like Swiss cheese in a sense. We're trying to make lots of little holes in a very sort of murky textual space, and it can be challenging to make a big enough hole to transform the object that we're trying to change. So I'm going to stop there and take a breath and have a sip of coffee, and Sinfrey can ask some questions.
Okay.
Which I don't guarantee to answer.
Okay. Thank you very much for this informative introduction. I must apologize. I haven't read the third edition because I wasn't aware there's a third edition, but I can assure you when it comes out, I'll read it. So the questions I'm going to pose come mainly from the second edition of your book. I want to concentrate on the issue of feminism and gender in decoloniality. Because throughout the book, on a number of occasions, you make reference to the fact that you are a mother, or when you want to do your postgraduate research, you had your kids, etc. And then let me read to you a quotation from page 190, where you are talking about issues relating to gender and issues relating to gender. You say this. So there is the possibility within Kaupapi Maori research to address the different constructions of Maori knowledge. A good example of this is the development of Maori women's theories about Maori society, which question the accounts of Maori society provided by men, including Maori men, but which still hold to a position that argues that the issues of gender for Maori do not make us the same as white women. So are you saying that the Maori men theories about Maori society may be different from those of Maori women? And then the theories of society by Maori women are different from the theories of society by white feminists. In other words, would you regard yourself as a Maori feminist decolonial scholar?
Well, there is a context, as always, to those kind of ideas. So let me start with the latter part of your question, which is around white women's feminism. Because I think for, Black women, women of colour, and for Indigenous women in particular, the biggest flaw of that feminism is it didn't address racism, or colonialism. And so there's a point at which, the critique of white patriarchy, we can sit on the side as Indigenous women and say, yeah, it's a patriarchal society. But even when white women get into control, they're just as racist. It's a racist white society. And so there was a departure point, I think, in the feminism, and I'm really going back into the sort of 80s and 90s versions of feminism, even Marxist feminism. There was just this failure to address racism and colonialism in fundamental ways, and an arrogance, actually, about speaking for Black women and speaking for Indigenous women. So here in New Zealand, and I know elsewhere, Māori women, I guess partly in reaction to feminism, and particularly in reaction to white feminists speaking on our behalf, developed our own kind of resistance and ideas about what it meant to be an Indigenous woman. But we're also in a society in which, the white colonizers were very good at recreating in their image, what our society should be like. For example, they never recognized that we had matrilineal power systems, that we, in fact, for Māori, it's bilineal. We descend equally from women and from men. Both those lines are equally important. But their patrilineal kind of approach meant I always call it the take me to your chief mentality. when white people landed, it's like, take me to your chief, because they thought there was a chief and that the chief was male. But, when Captain Cook arrived, one of the early descriptions in Captain Cook's journals and journals of others on his ship was of a very powerful woman who is, an ancestor of mine, an ancestress of mine. She was the most powerful woman in the territory. And all they did was describe the fact that she was wearing a spectacular cloak in red. What they did not recognize is she was a chief above all chiefs. So there's that way in which colonization worked to then try and recreate in Indigenous society the patriarchal structures of white society. And in doing that, I think a lot of our men were, because they were educated specifically to be the new generation of leaders, really bought into a lot of that patriarchy and sexism. And I think as Māori women, our fundamental position is, it's up to us to sort out our own internal gender relationships, but our struggle is for our sovereignty, our mana motuhake. Once we get that, our relationships as men and women fall back into place.
Okay. Thank you very much. Let me then continue with another question. You spent some time talking about critical theories, and you suggest something on page 188, which reminds me of a statement I had read from Elaine Cushman, who works amongst the Cherokee, and you write this. Bishop goes further to suggest that critical approaches to research have in fact failed to address the issues of communities such as Maori and the development of alternative approaches by the Maori people. Now, the question I have is, are you saying that the Maori, the critical research approaches failed to engage with the Maori as a society? Or is this a reflection somehow of the limitations inherent in critical approaches when they deal with Indigenous communities? Because I've heard the similar argument made by Elaine Cushman when she's talking about the Cherokee, that the critical approaches somehow fall flat when they're trying to engage with the Maori people. The question is why?
I'm kind of pivoting because my phone is running out of power.
Okay.
Yeah. All right, so I think the big failure of critical theory as well as critical approaches is they're good at describing the problem, but not good at seeing the possibilities of different kinds of solutions. And I think what Indigenous communities and peoples have most to offer is we have these still active paradigms of knowing, of being in the world. We have almost at our fingertips, some of it has to be reclaimed and restored, but we have ways of interacting with the world and being in the world and being ourselves in the world that I think offer a different kind of hope and a different kind of future. And I think, the problem with a lot of critical approaches that I see is people are good on critique, but they're not good on, so what do you do about it? What are the solutions? Where do you go? Because you can critique. The urgency for us is that's not enough. All right, in our communities, it's not enough just to critique. You can't, even if you're critiquing the government or the Crown, and you slay them in your critique, with your fabulous logic and all those things. But if you walk away and leave the people exactly where they were before, it is profoundly unethical. So I think, we're obligated to say, here's some potential solutions. Let's try those. Let's try these solutions. Let's think through into the future. So that's really where I think we take critical theory or we depart from critical theory.
Okay.
And critical approaches.
Okay. Now, this is my last question before I give over to Basi. You say in this book, for example, that it is written for the researched when they become researchers. Can you help me think this through? If, for example, you were to write a book in which the researched, let's say the Maori, were now going to research the white New Zealanders, what type of book would that look like?
Well, two things. I have been asked that.
Oh, okay.
Well, so here's the thing. There's some really great critical researchers who've talked about the idea of researching up the power. And I think any good Indigenous researcher who's trained in the decolonizing methodologies should be able to research up to power and talk up to power, speak to power. Our skills have to help us do that. So I don't think that's the issue, really. It's just the challenge of where we focus our efforts.
Okay.
Yeah. But the other part of that is, and I do hear that from some of my students, is whether whether the work they do as Indigenous researchers working with communities in itself will be transformative. Like, to what extent can you just do that and not address issues of power? When I think critical methodologies, I'm thinking fundamentally we're trained to think about the relations of power in any social setting that we might be working with. And I think if we lose sight of how power works, then we lose sight of the criticality of our research.
Thanks. I've got more questions, but I'll stop here and give over to Basi for the time being. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lena Smith and Sinfree. Esther has a question. Esther?
Hi. Greetings from the University of Minnesota on Dakota land. My question is, to what extent are Indigenous research and activities, let's say, and decolonizing methodologies mutual entailments? I know you write about this in your book. For example, when you raise the question of whether all research activities of a Maori researcher automatically constitutes Kaupapa Maori methods, or kind of conversely, whether a non-Indigenous outsider could carry out Kaupapa research. But my question is more geared at how do we researchers enter these tangles without then re-inscribing the researcher as the arbiter of what is authentically Maori and what is legitimately Kaupapa, or in other contexts, unsettling or decolonizing. And even if one takes a more radical approach to say, within some communities, to say that you must be Maori in order to carry out kaupapa research, then you're still making determinations of who is truly Maori and who isn't. So I just don't see a way out of that.
What a good question. And a question that often, comes up really about how essential it is for research with our communities, for example, to be done with Māori. I think I also say somewhere in the book is, in the end, our communities choose who does research for them, and sometimes we, or someone like me, will stand back and think, oh my God, look who they've chosen, probably the worst person ever. But that's not my right to choose, it's their right to choose. But it comes with consequences. And I would reinforce that, just because you are Māori and you do research doesn't necessarily mean that you do a kaupapa or have what we call a kaupapa Māori approach, because many of our researchers are trained in particular disciplines where they've inherited that discipline, and they have inherited the same arrogance of that discipline. So that in itself, just being Māori, doesn't necessarily mean, in our view, that they are ethical, that they have a decolonizing approach, that they understand power, or that they understand that, research can't be exploitative. I'd like to say that all Māori researchers would know that, but I've come across several who don't know that. I mean, in the end, they learn it because they get told it later after their training. So we can't control how all our researchers have been trained. And then there is, in kaupapa Māori research, we are actually very clear that to do that kind of research, you do have to be Māori. And if you're not Māori and you want to be in it, you can't be the boss of it. You can't be the principal investigator. You walk alongside us as a good ally. And yes, that's political, but it's also an approach that works. We, in the end, bear the brunt of any accountability. And the problem with non-Māori or white researchers is they can always walk away. When it gets hot, they jump out of the fire. We can't walk away. And, that's the difference. I think it's the difference for those of us who are having to bear the burden of a struggle, and those who are our allies. Allies can walk away. Same in research.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. There's a question from Christine. She notes that your book is extensively discussed at the University of Santa Catarina in Brazil. So you're well known there. She notes that she's been working with postgraduate students in language policy on your book, and quite a number of the Indigenous students are really very engaged in the debates that you proposed. But she does have a question around building a global community cross-border approach to Indigenous studies. She asked if you see the possibilities of a cross-border approach to Indigenous studies, one that is able to cope with singularities of local experience, but simultaneously build on some global movement that may be able to support local initiatives.
Thank you, great question. I think there's the beginning of quite a bit of collaborative research across different Indigenous contexts. Obviously, language differences mark these collaborations and how we go about doing them. And it's raised some interesting issues around, is it comparative studies we're doing? I think in the end, we've had to develop a whole ethic about what does it mean to work in collaboration? What are we trying to achieve when we work across borders? And of course, the borders themselves depends what our concept of borders is, because there are many Indigenous nations whose nation has been cut in two by colonial or imperial borders. So for some, the border itself is unreal or real. But I think it's across, say, jurisdictions, if I use that term, political systems, whether we can work at that level. And I think there is beginning that research, like, for example, it depends on the topic, like in the area of water rights. I can see there's a range of collaborative projects going on in Canada, New Zealand, Australia, those three countries where it's easier for scholars to kind of work together. I've been involved in cross three-country collaboration around HIV, and that was really hard. It was really hard to work across different systems and different contexts and different capabilities. But I think we have to go there. So your question is timely, and hopefully that's what you're going to do, because I think that's like a new arena where we have to develop the right protocols. Because the other thing is, you don't really want one Indigenous population building capability and then going and colonizing the next one. I think always we have to work in relation, that our relationality is a really important principle, and we have to work out how that operates. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And Limario also has a question.
Thank you, Vasi. Dr. Smith, my question is related to something to the previous question. I'm speaking also from Brazil, like Christina, but from Sao Paulo. Just let me say quickly, we met many years ago at Waikato. You may not remember, but through, what's the name? Well, anyway, let's get on with the question. My question is related to relationality and ontoepistemics in the decolonial production of knowledge. Because Indigenous communities, for Indigenous communities, relationality is extremely important. Now, working within Eurocentric universities, even though we're in Brazil, our universities are extremely Eurocentric. All our processes of, all our methodologies and our journals, etc., are all Eurocentric, meaning that they value the individual as a source of knowledge and not relationality or collaboration or whatever, right? Which you've just mentioned. And one of the principles of relationality, we have one of our Brazilian anthropologists who has studied a lot about our indigenous philosophies, Eduardo Vives de Castro. I'm not sure if you're familiar with his work.
Yes.
Yeah. One of the things that he has functioned more he has brought indigenous philosophies into our academies rather than claiming to represent them. And one of the things he has showed us is that relationality is also a degree involves translation. Because when you assume that knowledge is produced collaboratively, you're saying that knowledge is already produced, using Christina's term, as a cross-border phenomenon, right? It's coming from different places and it goes through a process of translation. And at the same time, it is transformed. So coming back to your critique when you say we just don't make critique. It's very easy to critique and more difficult to transform. But when we look at relationality, and relationality as collaborative translation and involving transformation collaboratively and collectively, we have a different kind of methodology of knowledge production. Right? I'd like to know what you think about this.
Yeah, you're right. It is different, and I think working in that relational space is, I've just lost the image. It is hard to translate it into the Western Euro context as well, to even explain what it is that we do, because in a sense, it's a whole system in itself, working in relational ways, and it's all encompassing. It governs our behaviors, attitudes, interactions, and you're right, it's the translation, transformational elements are deeply embedded in the relational elements, whereas in the more linear models of research, it's you do this, then you do that, and then it goes to translation, and then it goes to action, and then it goes to impact, and it can still end up being absolutely non-transformational. Whereas I think our idea about relationality is also linked to the idea of sort of collective well-being, that collectively we move together, collectively we engage with knowledge, and collectively we experience the transformational components. But when our relationality is broken, when we're out of balance, for example, when humans, the human world has almost destroyed many aspects of our environment, and our environment is unwell, then the struggle of our relational approaches, I think, is how do we restore that balance? It's the same with gender. How do we restore our balance? And that's actually kind of a big challenge for us, because, right now, the planet is not a healthy planet. Terrible things are happening as a result of climate change, which Indigenous communities have anticipated, and which I know there Alaskan elders a wee while back had predicted the melting of the ice caps years back, and people laughed at them, that they didn't know what they were talking about. But changes to our environment change us, and relationships with animals and other entities that are then disappear off the landscape are a loss to who we are and our identity. So we've got a huge recovery task that we're also trying to do, not helped by the green movement, might I add. The conservation movement is not our ally in this space. So that's a challenging question, but I do think, just generally speaking, that these deeper Indigenous philosophies that really inform our methods, inform our approaches, are really important. And having them available and really thinking about them deeply, I think is transformative, in the sense of providing our students and colleagues a completely different model that they can work in.
Okay, thank you very much. Perhaps I could read through a couple of questions so that you take them together. Again from Brazil, Attila would like to know how values such as harmony, respect, balance, and so on play out in projects in the Maori community based on your observation. And he would also like to know what the uptake of academic scholarship by governments, by local governments is like from your experience. And then Rebecca is interested in indigenous methods and wonders what indigenous methods approaches you would propose for emerging researchers. So what indigenous methods and approaches would you propose for emerging researchers?
Yeah. Okay, so there's 3 different questions in there.
Yeah.
What was the first question?
Yeah, in projects you have observed in the Maori community, how do values such as harmony, respect, and balance play out?
Yeah. Okay, so my current research has been in the area of trauma, and currently doing a nationwide project on family violence and domestic violence. So, when we're thinking about balance, harmony, those values, they are completely out of whack. When we look at what's happening in the trauma space and in the domestic family violence arena, but those ideas of balance, those ideas of harmony, are the aspirations that our communities have, and in a way, it gives them a vision to strive for. For example, working with families, who experience family violence. What is it? What kind of family do they want to be? Well, obviously they want to be a family based on love, because they still love each other. But a family that can live well together, can live in harmony. And, part of our role is to stretch those ideas, to move them away from some sort of romantic fantasy of harmony to something that they can actually achieve step by step, by reducing violence, for example, physical violence, verbal violence, by participating together in programs that support them, by re-engaging with Indigenous value system and concepts, which give them different tools to understand how a marriage or partnership should work, how parenting should work, the relationship between siblings. So in a way, those Indigenous values help drive, many of our social programs and actually help drive the practitioners in terms of the skills that they use to engage our people. It's different if you're working in the environment space where, those relational values are also important, because they're often still practiced by many of our people who, for example, fish. They're fishermen, they're hunters, gatherers. For them, those are driving principles of how they do their work. And they get really distraught when they see others take too much fish, exploit the environment, leave rubbish around. So in an interesting way, we can see, those values aren't far away from us. They're not entirely romantic. We can see parts of our community live by those values, and then other parts of our community where those values have not been part of their lives. And I think, the biggest struggle is how do we put it all together? It's very fragmented. So that's that question. And what was your other question, Bessie?
It was about the uptake of academic research by the local authorities.
Well, if you're meaning the local white dominant authorities, the optic there is they're still, you know, they still go to white mainstream journals and researchers for authoritative views. But in the New Zealand context, that is getting more and more difficult because we have some top researchers now who are Māori. You cannot avoid their work because they publish in the best journals. Their work is very influential. They're very articulate, and our younger generation of scholars are much better than my generation in influencing policy and being able to translate research into policy engagements, those sorts of things. So the optics in terms of local government is still challenging. Local government, I say, unlike central government, who we refer to as the Crown, our local governments were started really as very much part of the colonial agenda. Townships were originally where settlers, you know, were able to function. So they've been really deeply racist because they feel really entitled to make decisions about what happens in a township, for example, with water, with rates, with the tools that they have to deal with, that local government deals with. And I think our government has just passed an act that all local governments have to have Māori representation on councils, on decision-making authorities. And that's because it's been extremely difficult to get our people, to vote, because they're so disengaged with local government, but also to break through this barrier of racism. So the optics there are changing, and I think in the next decade, they'll be really different. But the other optic I want to talk about, which is how do our communities regard Māori researchers? And, you know, I'm happy to report that we're sort of slowly rising in the estimation of how they think about us. You know, it used to be that they thought if they got a Pākehā or white researcher, that would make, you know, what they wanted to achieve more legitimate. But now they're starting to see that Māori researchers understand them better for a start off and are able to still be influential in the work that they do. And we're producing, some of our communities are producing beautiful research and in collaboration with Māori researchers. So that's a positive step.
Okay, and the third leg of that was your suggestions with respect to Indigenous research methods and approaches for young researchers, for emerging researchers.
Yeah. Well, it depends really what disciplines and fields your young researchers are coming out of. I mean, I think a good piece of research is a piece of research that's well done and completed, like a good PhD thesis. And I think for beginning researchers, it's really been able to do a project that's, you know, within their skill set, that stretches them, that enables them to build those relationships at a basic level. I'm quite careful with my own students and postgraduates about what they step into when they go out into the world. I think it's important that they achieve success and therefore not take on projects that are going to overwhelm them. Because, you know, our communities think, oh, she's graduating. Well, we'll ask her to do this humongous research, which is going to completely overwhelm her. And my job as a mentor and a supervisor is to pull that young person back and go, no, you're not ready. You're not ready yet. You need to get some good track record. You need to build your skill set, because a PhD takes you basically to the beginning of a journey, a new journey into becoming a researcher. And all I would say now is I'm a way better researcher now than when I first wrote Decolonizing Methodologies, because you're on a learning journey and things are more nuanced. You learn your own weaknesses, and you learn, wow, that didn't work. Thank God the world wasn't watching me when I messed that thing up. So we become better as we do it. It's like work. We get better at doing the work. And so for emerging researchers, young scholars, we want them to be successful. So I think it's starting out with the steps that will send them in that direction.
Okay. Just before I call on Sally Coco, Nicole has a question. Nicole says, based on your earlier comment where you noted, where you talked about allies and the ability to walk away when the going gets hard, how have you handled white researchers who have attempted to position themselves as the experts within your community and use this research to catapult themselves as transformational scholars in the spaces?
I don't work with them. True. I don't. I know who they are, and I'm not a person who attacks them. I don't really want to waste my energy. My energy I put into our community and our scholars and our young people. So that's where I choose to put my energy. And every now and again, we've got a couple of well-known scholars who are constantly used by the media to be the authoritative voice on Māori. And, the younger ones attack them on Facebook and social media and that. But, to me, our struggle in the decolonizing space, it's a long-term struggle. That one white person, they're a problem, but they're just one. Where we're going is a long journey, and I think some of us have to keep our sights on that long journey and not get distracted. The best way ultimately to overcome that sort of single white authority person is to grow our own authorities, but also to grow the number of people we have in the media and journalism, across society, in order that, they will determine who the genuine authorities are. Thankfully, the number of white experts, I think, about Māori are diminishing. They're either choosing not to speak, or they know better not to speak. They will defer to someone else. And it's kind of interesting, there is gender dynamics in there too, because it tends to be white men and a couple of white women. But when I was an undergraduate student, all the authorities were white. That's not true anymore.
Okay, then maybe we'll take a question from Sally Coco Mufwene.
Thank you. Before I ask my question, in the spirit of decolonizing things, can somebody give me hints about how to change the color of the raised hand? Because mine doesn't reflect my color. So, Thank you very much, Linda, for this thought-provoking presentation on methodology. In my office, and you can find this also online, there's a poster of Bob Marley, the singer Bob Marley, saying, "Emancipate yourself from mental slavery."
Yes.
We suggest that you don't have to be an outsider to carry on the bias that you are pointing out. And in a way, we can also say we have all been colonized in one way or another because we believe that academic knowledge is objective. And there are consistent criteria and methodologies that everybody has to practice, to apply. But what is missing is, in that is the element of power. And I think it's Bonaventura de Santos that speaks of cognitive empire, which has that connotation of power. And I also heard a couple of other people speak of authorities on this particular subject matter, on that kind of knowledge and so forth. And I think that conceiving of academic knowledge as objective is a matter of convenience, because as individuals, we are all subjective. And the construction of knowledge doesn't start in academia, it starts with how we interpret the world in a vernacular way around us and adapt to it. Every one of us that survives has developed their own theory of the world and so forth. Nonetheless, those theories are very similar, and that comes the dimension of culture, that we are more or less prepared by our respective cultures to look at the world in particular ways, which really gives a lot of power to your suggestion that the Maori women, for instance, should have the right to present their own perspective on not only Maori culture, but the world as they see it, especially if they have been brought up in a culture that assigns specific roles to women that are different from the roles of men and things like that. And so I'll just give another example and then I'll let you comment on all this if you can. In linguistics, we have been talking about saving languages and language endangerment and so forth. And I have heard from a senior white American scholar who I respect the following thing. The best thing to do in the case of, say, African languages, his name is Paul Newman, in the case of African languages is train African students to do very good descriptive linguistics, and they can go and describe their languages and so forth. But when you put things in perspective, that training is provided in the United States by white American experts and so forth. And if the African students are not critical, how can we put an end to that colonial structure? Because they are going to apply what their professors taught them to do. And in order to get a degree, you have to satisfy your professors or you don't get, okay? So I think what I want to say here is that we cannot keep talking about decolonizing knowledge just in terms of Europeans who have developed a particular research paradigm as opposed to non-Europeans, but also in terms of people trained by Europeans stepping back and asking, have I been taught the right things to do? Are there alternative ways of explaining things? Should we be approaching, for instance, methods that have to do with society, culture, religion, and so forth, the same ways that we should be approaching physics and chemistry and the like? So I think what I want to suggest here is the need for self-introspection to see whether what the training that one has received is adequate for the kind of inquiry that one is engaged in.
Well, you've just identified the classic kind of dilemma of education and development, if you like, where, you know, decades ago, the young, bright native school student was identified and sent away to a metropolitan country to be trained. And they either didn't come home, or when they came home, they were considered utterly useless to the communities that they came from in the first place. That this whole idea that education in the end was used as a tool of assimilation. And I think you're right that, you know, we've had that generation of scholars trained in the US and in the UK in particular, here in New Zealand, who they were seen as the generation that could begin to save us or begin to do the work that was needed in our community to revitalize our language and to begin the work of our culture. And, you know, I think, I mean, that's my family in a sense, because my father did his PhD in the US in art, and then came home as a professor of Māori studies. But, you know, he's had to work really hard to re-establish his credibility once he came home. And, you know, he's had a lifetime of scholarship here in Aotearoa. And then my generation's a little bit different because we weren't sent abroad. We were educated here in New Zealand's university system and educated primarily by definitely by non-Māori, non-native teachers, but many of my teachers were from either the UK or the US. So there was this Anglo-American hegemony that's still powerful in our academies here in New Zealand. But, you know, where I am right now is we've started our own tribal institutions of higher learning. And my father is the founder of one of those. And we teach 2 PhD, we're 3 PhD programs, a professional practice PhD and a PhD in Indigenous studies and another PhD in Māori studies, which are accredited in the New Zealand system. And we're starting to produce our own graduates. So one of the insights I would say is, you know, just because we have our own institution, that we have our own scholars who've got PhDs from all around the world, literally, who are teachers, does not mean we don't need to do that decolonial work in our own people and in our own communities. I mean, because as you know, the power of colonization and colonialism, it's what Ngugi wa Thiong'o has said, is it's in our minds, in the paradigms of how we think. And so that, you know, epistemic sort of violence of colonialism is in the way we even engage with knowledge and what counts as knowledge and what's true knowledge and those sorts of things. And we see it all the time in our language revitalization school systems where they're learning and immersed in our language. And we have these like weird, I think they're kind of almost ridiculous debates about whether if you speak your native language, it means you're not colonized. And I'm saying, well, just because you speak your native language does not mean to say you are not colonized. You can be an idiot in your native language and you will still be an idiot in another language because you're an idiot. And that's how I break it down. Unless you think differently, unless your language and your cognitive processes are aligned. And what we know from colonization and all the work the brilliant scholars have been doing in the space of cognitive justice is we live with cognitive dissonance all the time. That's kind of the legacy of colonialism. And, you know, a big challenge for us is to wrestle with that dissonance and try and create a good way to live.
Oh,
So,
thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so very much, Linda Smith. We'll just take a final question from Vishna, who wishes to know what your suggestions would be regarding giving voice to Indigenous students and people of color in white dominant institutions, such as Penn State. Students who see themselves as underrepresented in these institutions and who are very often misunderstood by the professors. Any recipe for talking back, fighting back, wrestling?
Yeah, that's so, I don't know the context of Penn State. But I think the dilemma for all our young people in these academic institutions is how do they make space for themselves to be themselves and to be able to voice the things they need to, and how can they do it without sacrificing their own studies, you know, and that's that sort of dilemma, if you like, of activism is especially in the academy, is in the end we want our young people to finish their degree, but we also want them to do a degree that's going to be useful in our community, and we want them to practice their skills and to use their voices, but not at the expense of their success. So that's a hard one. I think, you know, my advice is students are better when they're in community, when they have strong kind of senior leaders, and they're not exposed to fighting these battles as individuals. Because I think what students don't realise is the huge gains. Like, it's a global machine, and it's a global clobbering machine. It can clobber them. So student movements, however, are very powerful. I was part of a student movement, and you learn a hell of a lot of skills being a student activist and being part of a group of activists. But that comes with a price as well. And it's really important to get the balance. But for Penn State, I'm not sure what your context is. I basically think all universities struggle with student voice anyway, let alone the voices of students from communities of colour and communities of difference. It's really important that academic scholars are supportive, that the kind of community alliances are in place, because one voice alone, unless it's an amazing voice, will struggle to be heard. a choir will get heard. And so it's that collective voice that's important.
Okay, thank you so very much, Professor Linda Smith. We'd like to draw the curtain on this part of this very lively set of engagements we've had, and now yield the digital floor back to Sinfree.
Okay, thank you very much. We're now going to move on to the more informal section, where if people have got any questions and which they want to raise, they can raise them. They don't have to direct them to Dr. Linda Smith. But before we do that, there's one emerging scholar called Rebecca Bayek who wanted to talk briefly about her research project. I promised her that this would help her give that project much more international visibility. So she will talk for about 3-4 minutes about what she thinks she's trying to do. Rebecca.
Thank you, Dr. Makoni. I'm so sorry, my camera doesn't work. So not my camera, but actually I have some allergies to my eyes, so I have to put my picture on there. Thank you, Dr. Linda Smith. That was really powerful and very insightful. I enjoyed the session. So back to my 3 minutes. So I'm working on what they call in the game literature, indigenous game, but I don't like that name. And I would rather, because chess as well, if you go by that, chess should be called an indigenous game, but they don't use that name to call chess an indigenous game. So I'm working on what we call African board games. And one thing that I'm interested in is I'm creating some kind of bibliography on that. And I was wondering, and just kind of have an open call to ask anyone who's based on the continent and Africa, who maybe has some information about the dissertation, or somebody who's working on any African board games, to reach out to me. I'm going to tap my email down there with any kind of resources, information, or connect me with any scholar. So that was kind of the point I wanted to make, and just use this network, this platform, to reach out to folks out there. So that's it. If you have more questions, just please ask me. Thank you, Dr. Makoni, for giving me the floor.
Right. Okay. Thanks a lot. Yeah. Now we're getting to the more informal section. I'm rather curious to know, my sister Ronke, what's your take on this? Mm-hmm. You are muted. Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
Yes.
My take on which aspect of it?
No, your take on all these discussions about decoloniality, gender, femininity that we're discussing. What's your response?
Well, I was elated to listen to Professor Smith, especially on gender and women's epistemologies, because I have written about the epistemologies of motherhood.
Yes.
And I see parallels between what she was saying and of the ways in which I think about Africa.
Yes.
Because there's a lot of parallels there.
Yeah, there are lots of parallels. What's interesting, Linda, is that if you are dealing with issues about women epistemology, you can't do that without having to consult the work by Ronke. So when I was citing the issue about Maori women and Maori women epistemology, I was connecting it back to Ronke's work without officially saying so in public. That's why I'm handing over to you. That you are the source of the idea, so you can as well articulate it more effectively than I can.
Yeah, and then of course, for me, the way in which I have approached gender and the whole idea that gender categories are westernized, are Western categories. Part of what I see is that they only focus on this dimension. So I was so happy, Professor Smith, when you talked about other levels, other ways, other epistemologies, really. Because in my work on motherhood, I said that in order to understand the questions and the interpretations of Yoruba society in Nigeria that I was putting forth, you have to understand first and foremost that motherhood is a spiritual category. And once you understand motherhood as a spiritual category, you would ask a different set of questions rather than when people are in the family situation, who does the dishes, who doesn't, because then you already assume a nuclear family in places where the family systems are different. So I thought it really resonated with me, the idea that knowledge is not just academic knowledge or the way it has been codified in the West. In people's communities, their ideas about knowledge are at different levels and in different sectors. So I related to that very well. But one of the issues on my mind, and I don't know, you've spent 90 minutes, you've been talking all the time. I don't want to make you talk again, but you know, I haven't read your book in a while. So I don't quite remember how you dealt with certain issues. But I have to say to you that as Africans and as an African scholar, one of the major problems we live now in and out of the continent is the degree to which we are thoroughly colonized, and we are colonizing ourselves and our knowledges. And it seems to me that one of the major issues that we're facing is what somebody calls colonial Christianity. Many African scholars don't want to look at indigenous knowledge. Some don't even want to bear their own names anymore because they said that, oh, it's pagan. It is calling upon on forces that are pagan and all that. This is how many centuries later? I thought we left that behind, you know? So that's one of the major issues. And I just wondered that in New Zealand, in Maori communities, how has Western religions, what role has it played, or how do you navigate it in the community?
That's one of those big, heavy questions, because we've been thoroughly Christianized as well. But our main denominations, the Church of England, Roman Catholic Church, have very strong Māori arms to them, and in a way they've been sort of successfully navigated and indigenized many aspects of the way the church functions, that, you know, because the missionaries were the ones who translated our language, translated the Gospels into Māori language. And so Christianity is a big part of who we are. I think the fundamentalist Christian movements are ones that are much more recent and are more antagonistic to Māori customs and Māori value systems. And then we've got Māori religions that kind of came out of a Christian faith in a sense. So in a way, they're very Māori in the way they do things, but they rely on the Bible, and they are basically Christian in their belief system. So it is really complicated, and I think many of our sort of non-Christian ceremonies would still be held more in secret and more in particular kinds of groupings. But, you know, our belief is we don't see ourselves as having had a Māori religion, but we do see ourselves as a spiritual people, and that spirituality is really important, fundamental to our culture, and that our spirituality is different from the way religion is. and what religion is and the way religion is organized and institutionalized. But it is an area we have to navigate carefully. And, you know, it's often in families, and then it's often the reason families are split and divided because they're in different religions. You know, one funny story in my husband's family, the grandmother, when the different churches came to town, she thought, well, she'll hedge all her bets. So she sent one child to the Mormon church, one child to the Anglican church, and one child to the Catholic church. And then they used to come home and decide which one had the best morning tea, served the best food, and then, you know, other members of the family would go to that one. You know, that her take on religion was not really about the religion, but about, you know, what else they could offer the people. And certainly for many, yeah, even my own family. I mean, my own family are Anglicans. I've got my cousin who's an Anglican minister. That we live sort of, this is what I was meaning about the cultural dissonance that we live with, that it is part of what we've had to incorporate. But I think, you know, the one thing that would bind us together are our relationships, what we call our genealogies. And that's in the end what ties us together. And then all our obligations as a community, because Christianity hasn't been able to break that down. You know, in the end, we come from a place, we come from a mountain, we come from a river, we come from a tribe. We go back to the land when we die. That's something that religion has not broken in our fundamental belief system. But it is a hard one.
Okay. Let me try and see if I can ask Christine Higgins, what's your take on these discussions? I wonder whether you're there. Christine. Yes.
Josephine has had her hand up for a while.
Oh, okay, Josephine,
yeah,
yes.
Please
okay.
go ahead. I'm happy to listen.
Okay, Josephine, then I can move on to Christine, yes. Josephine.
Okay, thank you. Good evening from South Africa, Pretoria. I'm from the University of South Africa. I'm Nigerian. And I just listened to my sister, Oyeronke, and I hear what she said in terms of some of us from Jerubaland changing our names from Ogun and Ifa to Jesus and all of that. But I also have a counter-example from my hometown. My hometown is Kaba, and we are known as the Oku Yoruba people. And we have the Catholic Church is very, very strong in the town. But there has been a lot of very interesting things that have happened in terms of enculturation. So for example, when I was younger, our parents would give English names, but that has changed. We've gone back to giving our indigenous names, even for our baptism and confirmation. But the best thing that I thought that has happened in my town is how the cultural ways of dancing, of singing, the tune of our songs and everything, they have been incorporated into the liturgy of the Catholic Church, so much so that if you are in the church, you could be dancing to the tune of Iworo. Iworo is like a particular kind of musical dancing ceremony that we have. So all of that has come into the church, and you could be a Kaba person in the Catholic Church with all the ululations and everything. And I think maybe that should also come into light as much as we talk about those who are also changing from Ifa and Ogun to Jesu, Bani and all of that. I just thought that I should mention that. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Say something.
Yes.
Yes. I just want to respond to that.
Okay, do.
When you look at the history of Christianity in Jerubaland, yes, they went through a phase during which, in fact, by the turn into the 20th century, Yorubas were telling the missionaries that they don't, when they are baptized, they can take new names and they want to take new names, but that the new names need not be English or biblical names. So Yoruba society went through all that. The liturgy, all that you said, they incorporated all that. But since the 80s, there has been another shift with the Pentecostalism, people denouncing their mothers in church and ancestral blood. They tell you their mothers are witches, ancestral blood. So the trajectory, things are changing and changing in all sorts of funny directions. And as long as people hold Jesus as a white man, it fits into white supremacy. And there's no question that no matter how many liturgies you introduce, right now with the fundamentalism, churches like the old school Anglican or Catholic Church, they're actually on the retreat because of the Pentecostalists. And they find themselves trying to catch up with the Pentecostalist fundamentalists. And so beyond the fact that people introduce Jesus in the name, I actually see Yoruba people bearing English names, and that's unusual given the history. But since the 1920s, you have somebody sitting in Ibadan, they've never been anywhere else. They'll say, my name is Susan, and I'm scratching my head. Where does this come from? And then 2 years ago, I had a mentee in Ibadan, and her name was Ewa Jesu. So they put Jesus in the name, fine. And then she actually was saying that people would ask her, that name is so difficult. Locally, right? Yoruba speaking people, why can't you be Mary? And it's these processes that I'm talking about, post all that historical that you just recounted, that things are changing and we're entering a new phase of coloniality that is so disheartening. Thank you.
Good. All right. Now let's see if we can get Christina. I wanted to get a sense from Christina Higgins. What's your take on all this?
Oh, thank you for inviting me to speak. I just have been a grateful listener. I'm at the University of Hawaii, and I often, have many opportunities to think about the language and cultural representation of this place and my role in that. And it's very complicated. Most of my students are not from this place. Mm-hmm. And so far, I've only had 3 Native Hawaiian graduate students come through our program. And so I'm really trying to find ways, for academia to do better, especially in our local context of supporting Hawaiian students, of inviting them into the worlds that we have, but also trying to remake or refashion those worlds at the same time. And I think that that's crucial. So here at the university, we have Hawaiian studies and Hawaiian language programs where the majority of students are Hawaiian. But I think the problem is they're not seeing themselves represented or invited or as necessarily belonging in some programs like the one like linguistics, right? And so trying to figure out from a more administrative or professor role, like how to go about changing that. That's something that I'm trying to contemplate and work with other faculty very, very slowly toward. It's not a value even that's shared among many of our faculty. They see it as, the cream will rise to the top, and those are the ones who we accept, and that's it. So there's no intentional effort to think about, you know, where we're located in the world and what that means to everything that we do. There's a universalist notion of knowledge and intellectual, you know, endeavors, which I think is problematic.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Good. Right. Vishna, do you want to tell us about the next session? But I must say thank you very much to Linda and to everybody who has attended this session. I think this has been quite enlightening. And like Magda,
Dr. Ogoni, I think Esther has her hand raised.
Oh, Esther. Oh, okay. Esther, yes.
Well, I was just very curious, Professor Tuhiwai Smith, what time is it where you are? And do you have a favorite Taika Waititi movie?
It is nearly 11 a.m. Sunday morning. And do I have a favorite? Yes, but some of us movies are kind of problematic as well for us. But Boy, I think, because it resonates with many of our stories. He's got a really funky sense of humour, as you know, and he's a beloved film director here. And the tribe he comes from is related to my tribe. So it's just next door, just down the road a little bit where he's from. But yeah, he's a loved director and is very well known for A, his humour, but B, he's also slammed New Zealand for being racist and highlighted many of the issues of racism.
Okay. Is there anybody who has any other comments before we sort of wrap up? Right. Okay. Vishna, can you let us know what is the next session and when?
Of course, yes. Thank you again, Dr. Tuhiwai Smith, for this enlightening talk. As Christina Haynes mentioned, I've learned so much and was so grateful just to be a listener and hear your talk. I already am having in mind all the professors at my undergraduate university that I'll just forward this talk to once the recording is completed. But yes, so for our next session, it will occur on April 9th, which is again a Friday at 9 a.m. Professor Nancy Hunt from the University of Florida will be presenting the talk called, quote, Blackness and Madness, a working lexicon for a new Atlantic historiography, end quote. And we hope that you can make it to that session as well. Thank you all for being here and joining us today.
Okay.